This is going to be really complicated. I'm a little nervous about it because it's so complicated. And I'm going to have to go very much by my notes, which is going to slow us down a little bit. This is going to take some time. What I'm going to do is provide you strong evidence for one thing. And as I'm doing that, there's a whole lot of peripheral elements that'll come in, and I don't have time to prove all of those. It'll look as though I'm grasping at straws. I'm not. I could prove every single one of the things that I bring in if we had time, and they have been proven in my books and my papers. But I'll just have to refer to them, and you'll have to understand that I could prove those things also if I wanted to. Each thing leads to something else, and as I've said, it's a vast tapestry. So yesterday, I provided some very strong evidence that it was Mathew Franklin Whittier, of course myself in the 19th century, who was writing the star-signed reviews and essays in the New York Tribune from the fall of 1844 until about mid-1846. It was not Margaret Fuller, as the scholars believe. She falsely claimed it after a rumor got started that she was the author, and she falsely acquiesced. And then, as I said, when she then went to Europe as the paper's foreign correspondent, she continued to use it, but so did Mathew, because he'd been using it since 1829 and continued to use it until at least 1873. It was always his. There was a deep significance to it, which Margaret Fuller had no such significance to it for her. And it was his work. So we now can move forward with the working assumption that it was Mathew Franklin Whittier in New York City who was writing as the star in the New York Tribune, writing primarily reviews, but a few reports and essays and things like that, at the time that The Raven was published. It was first published in American Review in the February 1845 edition. However, Edgar Allan Poe contrived to scoop it by 2 days in the January 29, 1845 Evening Mirror, which he wrote for as a critic. That's a long story. We won't get into that. What we're going to get into is this clue, this monstrous whopper of a clue, which I referred to yesterday or a couple of days ago in my previous entry. And that is the review that Mathew, not Margaret Fuller, wrote for the Tribune for the November 26, 1845 edition. He reviewed The Raven and Other Poems by Edgar Allan Poe. That's Poe's compilation, where he took his stolen poem, The Raven, a bunch of stuff that he slapped together, and maybe one or two things he stole from other people, possibly. That's an inference here. And we see this review listed on the Edgar Allan Poe Baltimore Society. I forget the exact name. The Baltimore Society of Edgar Allan Poe. I can't remember how they put it. But they have an extensive website on Edgar Allan Poe, and it's really meticulous. They're wrong because they made this terrible, fatal assumption that Poe was a real author and not a massive plagiarist. So I think 90% of what Poe published was not his, and that he created himself out of thin air, basically. Of course, they don't have that opinion. They believe that everything attributed to Poe was his, and they proceed accordingly. But in terms of their dates and facts and figures, they're meticulous. So I will put up on the screen where they list this particular review. They say the Daily Tribune contains Margaret Fuller's long critique of The Raven and Other Poems. They assume, without any real reason other than Margaret Fuller's own statement, that it was hers, but there's lots of evidence that it was not really hers and that she was a liar. We've got three crooks here, three pretenders. One of them is Edgar Allan Poe, one of them is Margaret Fuller, and another one across the ocean is Elizabeth Barrett, the future Elizabeth Barrett Browning. All of them were phonies, who stole other people's work, and they got famous in particular off of Mathew Franklin Whittier's work because he had been stupid enough to share his poetry and his work with Edgar Allan Poe and Elizabeth Barrett Browning around, I think it was in 1842, the first half of 1842. For some reason, he conceived the idea of sharing unpublished work with the literati of that era, the famous writers of that era, and most of them, he must have sent to a whole bunch of people. Most of them probably gave him very polite feedback, people like Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, maybe Emerson, but a couple of them were phonies and a couple of them were plagiarists, and they stole his work published it as their own, and they got famous off it. And the crucial detail here is that Mathew was, in fact, a literary genius, good enough that his pieces made people famous. That's the crucial thing. And I'm not trying to be somebody special. This is just what I found, okay? This is the missing piece, the missing puzzle piece in all of this. Otherwise, if Mathew wasn't a literary genius, if he wasn't that good, there's no way his stolen work could have made these people famous like this, see? It would have, gotten published, and it would have maybe given them a little bit of credibility, but it was better than that, So what I'm going to do is read the first part of this review, and Mathew makes a whole lot of references in these things, references and code. He's put code in this thing. And I'm going to show you where he puts code in, where his secret references are, just like the references in the poem that I shared with you most recently about the winds of autumn. See, he coded that because that was an allegory for plagiarism, for plagiarists, and how they persecuted them. Well, he's put coded references in here. One in particular I want to show you, and I was just going to show you that one and make this a 10-minute video, but as I read through it, there's so many others, and it all hangs together, So I really have to go through this entire introduction. And this is going to take a little while. So let's see. I've got my notes, and I've got the review here printed out because, unfortunately, I do not have a physical copy of this one. This one was missing in the batch that I purchased. Somebody else apparently hung on to it. So he writes, Mr. Poe, well, first off, what I wanted to do was set the stage, Imagine, this is you. Imagine that you wrote a poem in your typical, black humor style, in horrible grief during a faith crisis when you were reading your wife's favorite books about the occult and the paranormal and about spirit visitations and things of that nature, and you were hoping she was right, and you were hoping that she would actually be able to visit you. And late at night, you're up there reading, as you often do, and you hear something at the window, and you're terrified, but you hope that it's her, and it turns out not to be, and you're let down, and your faith crisis comes back tenfold, with a vengeance, and you write this poem. And a few months later, the following year, because this was December 1841, you show it to this aspiring writer, Edgar Allan Poe, who's making a name for himself. And he steals it, I mean, how would you feel? And you're not able to defend yourself because A, nobody will believe you. But secondly, you're involved in this anti-slavery work, and you're connected with a whole bunch of people who are running the Underground Railroad in New York and New York State. And you cannot be the center of a public controversy, which it would have been, of course. And so you have to keep quiet. Now, remember that you have a penchant for vengeance. You have a vengeful streak. Mathew had a strong vengeful streak, but it was counterbalanced by his Christianity, by his Christian faith. So he was trying to turn the other cheek. He was desperately trying to see the good in people. He was forcing himself to try to see the good in other people and not attack, and believe that vengeance is the Lord's and that the situation would eventually become clear. He says this in the review, but it didn't. Here we are, 2021, and everybody still believes that this, literary imposter, Edgar Allan Poe, actually wrote this magnificent grief poem when he wasn't actually in grief himself. And the way he explains it in the Philosophy of Composition is ridiculous. I refer you, if anybody hasn't seen it, once again to my written blog and the entry of, I think it's February 2nd. It's a February edition of my written blog where I write a lampoon of Edgar Allan Poe's Philosophy of Composition. Check that out. So we're going to now proceed with the stage having been set. You understand the mindset of this person. He's been horribly ripped off. And not only ripped off of something he wrote that was deeply personal about his wife and his faith crisis, Even if it was humorous, it was, it was a deeply sincere poem about his wife, for crying out loud, and this guy has ripped it off. And now what's happened is his literary editor, who is Margaret Fuller on the New York Tribune, has not just asked, but she's directed him to write a review about this book. So he's forced, he has to write a review, but he knows darn well if he writes what he really thinks that she'll kick it out, see? So he has to hint. He has to hint around the corner as to what he really thinks about this book. And he's very good at this. Mathew is very subtle with his hints, and I proved it a dozen times or more. And I can give you all kinds of examples, but we'll see how he does it here. This is not a coincidence. This is not me reading into his writing that he's dropping these hints. This is the way he typically writes. So now we will proceed. My introduction was as long as the last entry. Mr. Poe throws down the gauntlet in his preface by what he says of, quote, the paltry compensations or more paltry commendations of mankind. Some champion might be expected to start up from the, quote, somewhat sizable class embraced, or more properly speaking, boxed on the ear by this defiance, who might try whether the sting of criticism was as indifferent to this knight of the pen as he professes its honey to be. So Poe came under a lot of criticism, and Mathew is saying he's thrown down the gauntlet and he can expect to be criticized. Now look at this phrase, knight of the pen. Now, I don't know how many people used this back in the day. You'd say that a tailor was a knight of the shears and a writer was a knight of the pen. Mathew loved this phrase. I don't think too many other people used it. I'm sure it wasn't just his. But I went through my database. I found 25 of Mathew's published works. It's out of over 2,300, but still 25 of his works, not counting the novels because my database doesn't cover his novels, from 1830 to 1857. There's one instance in the Dial, and I've told you that Mathew was the writer signing F in the first 2 years of the Dial. That was not F for Fuller, that was F for Franklin. Mathew used that before and after. And there's once in the material stolen by Francis Durivage and George Burnham, which I've referenced in recent entries. They stole a vast number of Mathew's pieces in his portfolio by apparently, as I gather by extrapolation, getting him to sign a bogus contract. Well, the knight of that phrase appears in one of the ones that they stole as well. So that's one of his favorite phrases, and it's an indication that he is indeed the author. So we go on with the second paragraph. Were there such a champion, gifted with acumen to dissect and a swift glancing wit to enliven the operation, he could find no more legitimate subject, no fairer game than Mr. Poe, who has wielded the weapons of criticism without relenting, whether with the dagger he rent and tore the garment in which some favored Joseph had pranked himself, secure of honor in the sight of all men, or whether with uplifted tomahawk he rushed upon the newborn children of some hapless genius, who had fancied and persuaded his friends to fancy that they were beautiful and worthy a long and honored life. Now, I've said elsewhere, and I'm convinced of this, the reason that Poe became a critic and the reason that he attacked everybody the way he did was to leverage himself up in the perception of the public as somebody of equal or greater status than the people he was attacking. It was an ego trip, in other words, where he was climbing up at the expense of people that he was trying to shoot down. It made him look, wise. It made him look like an expert. Well, he was no such expert at all, and his criticism was driven by the need to look like he knew what the heck he was talking about. And Mathew picks up on this. He doesn't say it in so many words. A large band of these offended dignitaries and aggrieved parents must be on the watch for a volume of poems by Edgar A. Poe, ready to cut, rend, and slash in turn, and hoping to see his own raven left alone to prey upon the slaughter of which it is the herald. Now, he's tacitly acknowledging, even at this point, he's saying that the raven is Edgar Allan Poe's. Of course, he knows it isn't. He knows it's useless for him to say it isn't. So he plays along. Such joust and tournament we look to see, and, indeed, have some stake in the matter, so far as we have friends whose wrongs cry aloud for the avenger. Well, he has a stake in the matter, all right, because he's one of the people that Poe has offended by stealing his poem. See, but he also has friends who've been attacked by Poe. Natheless, we could not take part in the melee, except to join the crowd of lookers-on in the cry, Heaven speed the right. He means that he cannot personally defend the raven for the reasons that I've just mentioned. However, he certainly is watching and hoping and cheering on the crowd of people who will attack Poe, despite the fact that the raven is his own poem. Puts him in a very awkward position. Early, we read that fable of Apollo who rewarded the critic who had painfully winnowed the wheat with chaff for his pains. Now, elsewhere in the Tribune, I don't have this in front of me, but there is a review of a children's book, and he mentions, first off, he mentions the birthday in the winter of himself writing, and he wasn't born in the winter, but neither was Margaret Fuller. Horace Greeley was born in the winter, but that wasn't written by Horace Greeley. So it was Matthew basically pretending to have been Greeley. But it was Matthew putting us all on notice that it was not Margaret Fuller writing these reviews, because she was definitely not born in the winter. But anyway, he mentions when he was growing up in a farmhouse, which Margaret Fuller did not, the books that were available for him to read. And it includes this book. I can't remember which one it was now, but it was the Odyssey and the Iliad, I think. But he mentions books that have to do with the Greek, myths and so on. So that's what he's referring to here. I apologize for my lack of my own scholarship. I really have avoided, reading, avoided a liberal arts education in this lifetime for reasons I've gone into before. Matthew went for it in a big way, and I felt toxic from what he'd done, and I felt the need to back off from that and focus on the writings of three God-realized teachers and eschew everything else written by ordinary mortals, basically, in this lifetime. So I don't have a liberal education purposely. Doesn't mean I'm stupid. Now he says, we joined the gentle affirmative school and have confidence that if we indulge ourselves chiefly with the appreciation of good qualities, looking for the good in people. Remember, he was born Quaker, and this was what he was taught as a Quaker, I believe. You'll see it with John Greenleaf Whittier all the time that he does this. He says, and have confidence that if we indulge ourselves chiefly with the appreciation of good qualities, time will take care of the faults. For time holds a strainer like that used in the diamond mines. Have but patience, and the water and gravel will all pass through, and only the precious stones be left. What he means is, again, the biblical teaching, vengeance is the Lord's. He means turn the other cheek. He means that eventually it'll come right. People will figure out that this imposter, this childish sociopath, Edgar Allan Poe, could not possibly have written The Raven. But Matthew was wrong. Society is still fooled. So I think that I, as the reincarnation of Matthew, had to come back and straighten this mess out, which is what I am doing as we speak. So he says, yet we are not blind to the uses of severe criticism, he is a critic himself, and of just censure, especially in a time and place so degraded by venal and indiscriminate praise as the present. In other words, people who are not discerning, good work from idiotic work. That unholy alliance, that shameless sham, whose motto is, caw me and I'll caw thee. Now, that comes from Byron, I believe. Let's see, I've got it written down here as to exactly where it comes from. It's Don Juan, which Matthew loved to quote. It happens to be Canto 11. Caw me and I'll caw thee. That's not the exact quote. I think that's kind of a paraphrase. Now, he continues, that system of mutual adulation and organized puff, which was carried to such perfection in the time and may be seen drawn to the life in the correspondence of Miss Hannah More, is fully represented in our day and generation. Now, I've got my notes on this. There's a little biography that says, Hannah More, one of the 5 sisters, taught at her family school in Bristol, England. She became prominent in London's Blue Stocking Literary Circle, which means the female intellectuals, from 1774 onward, and was also a friend of Samuel Johnson, who Matthew admired. Her work soon moved from poetry and drama to the production of numerous popular books and tracts. There was a book published in 1835 after her death. Correspondence of Hannah More is given in, quote, The Life of Hannah More with selections from her correspondence, apparently Mathew was of the opinion that she kind of created herself out of thin air, out of PR, see? So that's what he's inferring that Poe is also doing. Now, when he talks about system of mutual adulation and organized puff means hype, Mathew used the phrase mutual admiration society a few times sarcastically. Let's see, one of them is in a satire about Margaret Fuller. He has created a phony female intellectual whom he calls Sally Sage, and he's particularly aggressive with this, I think because such a person had taken him for a ride. That's what I gather from the 3 installments of this. They appear at the very end of the run of the Boston Weekly Museum. This one is, I think it's the 3rd one, May 22nd, 1852. I'll put it up on the screen. Now, the quote that he uses at the top is from Margaret Fuller's posthumous memoirs. It shows her arrogance, but the gap in between also points to something that has to do with him personally. The strong inference is that Ralph Waldo Emerson had praised Mathew as a philosopher and had mentioned him to Margaret Fuller, and she had poo-pooed the whole thing that, basically he admires me and, he doesn't know near as much as I do. That's what Mathew was hinting at in that quote. But here he has Sally Sage, his character, speaking of basically channeling Margaret Fuller in her dreams. See, there were people who were kind of channeling Margaret Fuller as though she was a great sage or a great saint, and they worshipped her practically. So here he has his character say, I have read those 3 sweetest of all sweet volumes of her biography. Last night I saw her in glory, in the highest degree of the highest sphere, surrounded by a group of kindred spirits, all forming a grand mutual admiration society, and she, the Margaret, was president thereof. So that's an example of Mathew using the Mutual Admiration Society. It comes up again in the May 22nd, 1869 edition of the Portland Tribune, which Mathew frequently contributed to. We're talking 1869 now. So it also shows up twice in the material that was stolen by Francis Durvage and George Burnham. And he also talks about the Mutual Endurance Society, which is a scream. But anyway, I will put up on the screen the Ethan Spike, which we know historically, historians agree that that was Mathew's pseudonym in Mathew's series. This is the May 22nd, 1869 Ethan Spike. Gents, speaking to the editors of the transcript, if you'd a little liver than not, I think it's a typo there, if you'd a little liver than not, I wish you would head this thusly. From our intelligent and reliable Boston correspondent, Mathew was living in Boston and writing to the editors of the transcript in Portland. You can help me a good deal in this way. There are everywhere vulgar minds which don't appreciate intelligence. Some of the Boston Mutual Admiration Society, would you believe it, don't seem to appreciate me in that character. Indeed, I don't think Boston generally is aware half the time when it entertains angels. Not that I would profanely class my humble self with heavenly bodies, far from it, but figuratively speaking. So Mathew is playing the clown like Victor Borgia, but he's being quite serious. Because he has kept his light under a bushel so assiduously for so many years, the Boston elite, the literati, don't recognize him as an equal. But he is every bit their equal, if not their superior, see? And most of the time, he just accepts it. But sometimes it gets to him. Some particular thing happens, and, like Poe publishing the compilation that he did, and he can't resist anymore taking some pot shots. So that's what he did there. But here again, he's using that phrase, Mutual Admiration Society. What that means is these people would congratulate each other and pat each other on the back and publish each other and praise each other's work. And in that way, they would kind of bootstrap each other, up, when maybe they really weren't that great to begin with, any of them. See? Well, he's implying that about Edgar Allan Poe, I think. Now, we see that it meets a counteragency from the League of Truth Tellers. These are people who really can discern good work from bad. Few, but each of them mighty as Fingal or any other hero of the sort. Now, Mathew quoted Fingal in his own newspaper, the Salisbury Monitor, which he launched and briefly ran in from February of 1838. So we know he was aware of Fingal. Let such tell the whole truth, as well as nothing but the truth, but let their sternness be in the spirit of love. We'll see the exact same thing, the sentiment expressed in the pro-abolition letters, a series of 10 that he and Abbey wrote to the Dover Inquirer as Kappa, Lambda, and Mu. Let them seek to understand the purpose and scope of an author, his capacity as well as his fulfillments, and how his faults are made to grow by the same sunshine that acts upon his virtues. For this is the case with talents no less than with character. Now he's addressing the issue of character, round the corner, of Edgar Allan Poe's character. The rich field requires frequent and careful weeding. Frequent, lest the weeds exhaust the soil. Careful, lest the flowers and grain be pulled up along with the weeds. Poe is a weed. He's an imposter. And that's what Mathew is inferring in this case. Well, but to return to Mr. Poe, we are not unwilling that Cavil should do her worst on his book, because both by act and word he has challenged it. But as this is no office for us, we shall merely indicate in our usual slight way what, naturally and unsought, has struck ourselves in the reading of these verses, which is to say, he's working for an editor who is not going to allow him to be critical, and he's just going to honestly say whatever he would feel about the poem if Poe, not about the poem, about the book, if Poe had not offended him by stealing and falsely claiming his poem. He's just going to take it as objectively as he can. Now we get into the meat of it. It has often been our case to share the mistake of Gil Blas with regard to the Archbishop. Now that is a reference, and I've got it in my notes. I don't have this stuff at the top of my head. Those are references to a French novel by Alain René Lesage. And Poe had also referred to the story of Gil Blas and the Archbishop in his story, The Angel of the Odd, published the previous year, 1844. I think that was plagiarized. I'm pretty sure it was. It may very well have been plagiarized from Mathew, which is why he brings it up. But the gist of that story, it's like when somebody says, oh, give me honest feedback. I want your honest feedback. And then you give them honest feedback and they can't take it. They flip out. Mathew is saying that he is in that position under Margaret Fuller as the literary editor. She has said, probably has told him, just give your honest opinions. And he's thinking to himself, if I gave my honest opinions, I'd say that Poe was an imposter and a thief and that he falsely claimed The Raven, which was my poem. He can't say those things. So therefore, he's in the position of Gil Blas and the Archbishop. That's the reference there. We have taken people at their word, and while rejoicing that women could bear neglect without feeling mean pique, and that authors, rising above self-love, could show candor about their works, and magnanimously meet both justice and injustice, in other words, take feedback, we have been rudely awakened from our dream and found that Chanticleer, who crowed so bravely, showed himself at last but a dunghill fowl. We'll get to that in a minute. Yet heaven grant we never become too worldly wise thus to trust a generous word, and we surely are not so yet, for we believe Mr. Poe to be sincere when he says, quote, in defense of my own taste, it is incumbent, quoting Poe now, in defense of my own taste, it is incumbent upon me to say that I think nothing in this volume of much value to the public or very creditable to myself. Events not to be controlled have prevented me from making at any time any serious effort in what, under happier circumstances, would have been the field of my choice. Mathew says, we believe Mr. Poe to be sincere in this declaration. In other words, he was sincere. He really didn't have anything in the volume that was worthwhile. If he is, we respect him. If otherwise, we do not. Such things should never be said unless in hearty earnest. If in earnest, they are honorable pledges. If not, a pitiful fence and foil of vanity. Earnest or not, the words are thus far true. The productions in this volume indicate a power to do something far better. Now that's an interesting way to put it. With the exception of The Raven, which seems intended chiefly to show the writer's artistic skill, and is in its way a rare and finished specimen, they are all fragments fits upon the lyre, almost all of which leave us something to desire or demand. And then he gives an exception, which I think was 2-1 in Paradise, which is a poem of love for a lost beloved, which I think would have to have been plagiarized. Poe didn't write that. But look at the way he deals with Poe's theft of the raven. With the exception of the raven, which seems intended, doesn't say he wrote it, see, which seems intended chiefly to show the writer's artistic skill. It doesn't mean that he actually wrote it. It means that it's intended to show Poe's skill as though he had written it. Mathew very, very carefully chose his words here. I don't think I'm imagining that. I mean, I could be, but not knowing the whole circumstance and not having seen Mathew word things carefully, Mathew knows how to say the technical, honest truth without really saying the thing that's implied, while actually inferring something else. And that's what he's doing here. Now let's go back to Chanticleer. I have mentioned that Mathew used the word Chanticleer a number of times. I don't think I ran one on this. It's like 7 times in Mathew's legacy he used the word Chanticleer for rooster. It's French. It comes from La Fontaine's Fables. La Fontaine was a French author who translated Aesop's Fables. They're called La Fontaine's Fables. Here is volume 1. That's like one of the first editions. And I believe Mathew actually was the translator. And the reason I say that is because I have extrapolated that Abby, his future wife, 4 years younger, a literary prodigy in her own right, was tutoring Mathew. In lieu of him being able to get a college education, she was from a wealthy family. She had had a full European tutored education. She said, "I'll be your college. I will tutor you." And probably at first, because she might have been 8 years old when she first made this offer, or 9 or 10 or something. And he probably said, well, that's okay. And then he realized, no, she really can do it because she's brilliant and she's had really high-class tutored education. So she started tutoring him. A lot of this was by correspondence. Some was in person. And if you look at the poem called Wine of Cyprus, ostensibly by Elizabeth Barrett, the future Elizabeth Barrett Browning, that was written by Mathew Franklin Whittier after Abby's death. It's a description of how she tutored him. It was not written by Elizabeth Barrett about her tutor, Hugh Stewart Boyd. She adopted it to fool him into thinking she had written it for him. So that's an example of her tutoring him. Well, one of the subjects, because she was French, her father was a Marquis, she was half French, she would have been a native speaker. I know that they spoke French in her family home, the Poyen household, because if you look at Charles Poyen's book, Progress of Animal Magnetism in New England, if you look into that, you find a description of when he first came to America from Guadeloupe. He stayed for 5 months with his uncle. That was Abby's father. So he stayed for 5 months with the Poyen family there in East Haverhill, in Rocks Village. And he says that he left to improve his English. See, well, if they spoke English, he wouldn't have had to go to Lowell to improve his English. See, it actually was an excuse because her father was insufferable. But he gives as the excuse that he went to Lowell after 5 months to improve his English. That proves that they spoke French in the family. So Abby was a native French speaker, which means that she would have taught Mathew French. She actually taught him German and French. I have evidence that she also could translate German. That's in one of her stories called Mary Mahoney. That's another avenue of investigation. But I think that La Fontaine, because Mathew loved Aesop's Fables, that La Fontaine was his homework, to translate La Fontaine back into English verse. Well, they're excellent translations, way better than anything that had ever been done before. And they're brilliant, actually. And they're very funny. They're humorous. And that's because Mathew was an experienced humorous poet. Back from like age 12, he was writing really high quality humorous poetry and publishing it in the New England Galaxy. See, I don't know how far back to take these things, but this was published by Elijah Wright, who was Mathew's friend. But I think that as Mathew did with Asa Green and some other people, he said, publish this for me. Because when Abby was still alive in 1839, he and she had put together a little volume of La Fontaine's fables for young people. This is called La Fontaine, A Present for the Young. It does not say that Elijah Wright published it. It has in the copyright, it was registered by J.S. Wright. Now, I don't know who J.S. Wright is. That's not Elijah Wright, I don't think. So it might have been a relative. I don't know. But this was Matthew and Abby's book. And then after she died in 1841, I think he just handed everything over to Elijah Wright because they had intended to publish a larger one. This was what they called a trial balloon. And he said, I really can't do this, but if you would please publish it for me, and feel free to say that you were the translator, and that'll keep us out of it, because Abby wanted to stay strictly anonymous. So I think that was his. But now, look at this reference to Chanticleer, and found that Chanticleer, who crowed so bravely, showed himself at last but a dunghill fowl. That means Edgar Allan Poe. But what is he referring to? He's referring to one of the La Fontaine fables called The Cock and the Pearl. It's 2 stanzas only. And I'll show it to you here. And then I will put it up on the screen for you. The Cock and the Pearl. And I'm going to read it for you. A cock scratched up one day a pearl of purest ray, which to a jeweler he bore. I think it fine, he said, but yet a crumb of bread to me were worth a great deal more. Now listen to the second stanza. So did a dunce inherit a manuscript of merit, which to a publisher he bore. 'Tis good, said he, I'm told, yet any coin of gold to me were worth a great deal more. And there is the image I'll put up on the screen, the illustration. These illustrations were taken from the French, as I understand from the introduction. So if I'm not mistaken, and I'm not, in this review, because remember, Matthew had to get everything he wrote, he had to get it past Margaret Fuller. Okay. So he makes a reference to Chanticleer, who crowed so bravely, showed himself at last but a dunghill fowl. Now look close up at this illustration, and you will see that in the background there is a picture of a dunghill fowl scratching. This rooster is on a dunghill, see? So that tells us that he was referring to this particular poem. He's hoping that someone will look that up and read the second stanza, because his secret message is in the second stanza. So did a dunce inherit a manuscript of merit, which to a publisher he bore. 'Tis good, said he, I'm told, yet any coin of gold to me were worth a great deal more. That's his characterization of Edgar Allan Poe as a dunce and a thief. See? And there's more that I could pull out of this, I think, but that's what I wanted to present. That's where I wanted to end up on, so that's where we're going to finish. There's no question. And this is not the only piece of code that Matthew left us embedded in his various pieces, indicating that Poe had stolen the raven. There's quite a few more. There's like 17 of them total, or 18 or something like that. And they're in my paper. So if you get on the article section of my website, www.ial.goldthread.com, click on articles in the navigation bar, look for the one that has to do with the raven, and read that article. It's a lengthy article because it's so blasted full of evidence. Okay, not because I'm just pontificating, indefinitely. It's because there's that much evidence. It took me that many pages to present the evidence. I include this one, but I have a whole lot more of them. I'm not guessing about this. I have way more evidence than I need. And one interesting thing I noticed, that when I would post the link, the claim and the link to the article underneath YouTube videos about the raven, and I notice now that a lot of the people who are lecturing about the raven, they turn the comments off. Maybe they know the shit's hitting the fan and they don't want me posting. I don't know. I mean, they can block me anytime they want. But underneath the ones that haven't turned off comments, if I just put the claim and the link to the article, I get very sarcastic answers. Oh, yeah, right, things like that. But now I notice that if I give a nice long paragraph explaining the gist of what happened, how Poe scammed Matthew, and I explain it in some detail, suddenly I'm getting respectful responses, see? Oh, thank you for telling me about this. I'll look into this. And people are downloading the paper. I think I've had 82 downloads so far this month of that paper. And those are people that didn't go to Academia EDU because I give that option. Those are people that trusted the link and went ahead and downloaded it directly off the link. So it's getting a little traction out there. This is the kind of thing where when people first see it, they're going to react. That's ridiculous. If they see it the second time, they're going to, just like selling a product, the second time, well, that's interesting. I've seen that before. And the third time, it takes about 6 exposures, I think the marketing people will tell you, before somebody actually thinks about getting out their wallet and buying the product. Well, it takes about 6 exposures to this before people are going to think, gosh, I've seen that before. I wonder if there could be anything to it. So I expect that blanket rejection on the first exposure, and the second exposure, and maybe the third exposure, but it will get around. I'm leavening. I can't leaven by getting papers published because the people that write about Edgar Allan Poe are fans, and they're emotionally invested in Poe being a great literary figure, which he was not. He was an imposter, and they're not going to want to hear that, so they won't publish my paper. No matter how strong my evidence is, they won't publish it. So I'm just going around them. I'm just going to any other method like direct mail or posting, on YouTube and things like that, anything, or writing to, individual people on websites and so on. Reporters, I've gotten no response from reporters whatsoever. This is like the biggest story in the literary field in decades. And no reporter will even write back to me to talk to me about it. Pretty interesting, because the one that does, is going to have some kind of an interesting scoop on his or her hands. Hadn't happened yet. So that's the clue. I think it's airtight, personally, especially in the larger context of the tapestry of Matthew's work and his life, and in the larger context of all the other clues that Mathew himself dropped in all these other pieces. Read the paper.